In the late 1930s, the German army was looking for an armored vehicle capable of providing direct support to the infantry on the battlefield. From that need arose the Sturmgeschütz III, known in its abbreviated form as StuG III, a low-profile assault gun with great firepower that soon became one of the most produced and used vehicles by Germany during the Second World War. Its development spanned different versions, from the first models conceived to break defensive positions to improved variants with greater armor and armament adapted to prolonged combat. The doctrine of use, the organization of the units, and the conditions on the fronts shaped its role, shifting from an offensive tool to a defensive element in the face of the final collapse of the Third Reich. The technical evolution, the applied tactics, the documented cases of combat, and the high mortality of its crews make up a history marked by forced adaptation and resistance in extreme circumstances. To what extent did technical and logistical limitations determine that 80% of its crews did not survive the war? The birth of an assault gun. The experience accumulated by the German army in previous conflicts made it clear that the success of an assault depended on immediately neutralizing enemy defenses. During the First World War, fortified positions, machine gun emplacements, and protected artillery pieces had caused a high number of casualties to the infantry, even when field artillery supported the offensive. With this background, the command promoted a specific program to develop an armored vehicle that could accompany troops on foot in the advance, confront protected targets, and open a path in heavily defended areas. The responsibility fell to the Artillery Inspectorate, which defined the initial characteristics: a sturdy chassis, a large caliber gun mounted in a fixed position, and the ability to operate at the same pace as the infantry on variable terrain. General Heinz Guderian, a key figure in the development of German armored doctrine, participated in the initial discussions. The idea was not to create another tank, but a support weapon that combined the protection of an armored vehicle with the firepower needed to destroy fortifications and bunkers. The new vehicle had to have a low profile to facilitate its concealment, frontal armor capable of withstanding the most common enemy fire, and a quick-firing gun mounted in a fixed structure. A rotating turret was not necessary, which simplified the design and reduced the cost of production. The Daimler-Benz company was tasked with developing the first prototypes. The chassis of the Panzerkampfwagen III was used as the basis, from which the turret was removed to install a closed casemate with a 75mm short-barreled gun. The first models, called Ausführung A, began to be built in 1937. They had frontal armor of 50mm and side armor of 30, which protected them against most light anti-tank weapons of the time. Their reduced height allowed them to make better use of the terrain for cover, something that would later become one of their tactical advantages. The initial tests were carried out on German training grounds. There, the vehicles demonstrated that they could keep pace with the infantry's advance and destroy fortified positions at short and medium distances with great precision. The main armament, the 75mm StuG 37L/24 gun, was effective against fortifications and obstacles, although its capability against enemy armored vehicles was limited. The interior was organized for the 4 crew members, commander, gunner, loader, and driver, to work in a reduced but functional space. Communication between them was via an intercom, which facilitated coordination in combat. After evaluating the performance of the Ausf. A, improvements were introduced. In 1940, the Ausführung B series was manufactured, which incorporated a more reliable Maybach HL 120 TRM 300 horsepower engine, better internal ventilation, and small adjustments to the side armor. This was followed by the Ausführung C/D version, with structural reinforcements and minor changes in the arrangement of the hatches. Finally, the Ausführung E added additional compartments for ammunition and a machine gun mounted on the top for close defense, although its use was limited by space and the protection of the gunner. While these versions were leaving the factory, the High Command ordered the formation of the first specialized units, called Sturmgeschütz Abteilungen. Each one had several batteries equipped with the new assault gun, and their main mission was to directly support the infantry in planned attacks against well-defended enemy positions. The training of the crews was intense and focused on both the aiming of the gun and coordination with infantry units. Joint advance maneuvers, rapid fire on designated targets, and changes of position to avoid being targeted by enemy artillery were practiced. In the first large-scale exercises, commanders noted that the StuG III could move more quickly and discreetly than a standard tank. Its lower height and the absence of a turret made it a less visible target for enemy observers and gunners. However, the limitation of the short-barreled gun against armored vehicles or well-protected anti-tank pieces was already becoming evident, so its use was strictly linked to the role for which it had been designed. The first deliveries to the field units occurred before the start of the invasion of France in 1940. In that scenario, the StuG III demonstrated its usefulness by traversing obstacles and neutralizing fortifications that delayed the infantry. Their firepower and frontal armor, which was sufficient to withstand light weapons, made them a valuable tool for breaking defensive lines without always having to resort to long-range artillery. On the Eastern Front, during the early phases of the invasion of the Soviet Union, the StuG III of the initial versions participated in combat where their support function remained clear. They attacked fortified positions, covered the infantry in assaults, and repelled light counterattacks. The extreme conditions of winter put their mechanics to the test, but their robust design and the simplicity of their systems allowed many units to continue operating even in adverse climates. The acceptance of the StuG III by the infantry commanders was quick. Its presence on the battlefield gave the troops on foot the confidence of having direct support capable of destroying obstacles and resisting the most common fire. The coordination between assault guns and rifle units became a standard tactic that, in those first years, offered remarkable results. Although technical improvements and adaptations were still needed to face new challenges, the concept had proven its validity. Technical evolution and changes on the battlefield. The entry into service of the StuG III in 1940 marked a starting point that, in a few years, forced its designers to introduce continuous changes to respond to a rapidly evolving combat environment. The appearance of enemy armored vehicles with increasingly thick protection and more powerful guns, as well as the experience gained on the first fronts, revealed the need to increase the firepower and resistance of the vehicle. The initial versions, effective against fortifications and light targets, began to find limitations when they faced tanks like the Soviet T-34 or the KV-1, whose armor far exceeded the capabilities of the short 75mm gun. The first major modification came with the Ausführung F series, introduced in 1942. The most significant difference from its predecessors was the installation of the 75mm StuG 40L43 gun, a long-barreled weapon that notably increased the projectile's muzzle velocity. This allowed it to penetrate medium armor at much greater distances and offered a real capability to directly confront enemy tanks. The increase in power forced the casemate structure to be reinforced and adjustments to be made to the gun's balance to maintain stability during firing. The frontal armor was increased to 80mm, while the sides remained around 30, with the possibility of adding additional bolted-on plates to improve protection against portable anti-tank weapons. In the same line of evolution, the Ausführung F/8 version introduced changes to the chassis. This model used the base of the Panzerkampfwagen III Ausf JEL, which allowed for the incorporation of mechanical and transmission improvements. The gun was changed to the StuG 40L/48 variant, which was even longer, with better ballistic performance and greater effectiveness against heavy armor. The frontal armor plates continued with 80mm, but a more vertical arrangement was now adopted to increase effective resistance. Supports were also added for the so-called Schürzen, thin side plates intended to protect the tracks and sides against hollow charge projectiles, which were becoming more common among enemy infantry. Inside, the crew layout was optimized to handle a larger and heavier weapon. The space for ammunition was increased, although this meant a higher density of projectiles in a small compartment, with associated risks. The ventilation system was improved to vent smoke after firing, which was especially important with the long gun. The driver's position received a new periscopic sight with a better field of view, while the commander had a new rotating cupola equipped with several observation slots, allowing for wider control of the environment without exposing the body. Regarding mobility, the Maybach HL 120 TRM 300 horsepower engine continued to be the standard, but with slight modifications to the cooling system to cope with extreme climates. On the Eastern Front, lubrication and component insulation were reinforced to withstand winter temperatures well below zero. In scenarios like Africa, on the other hand, additional air filters and modifications to the cooling system were installed to prevent overheating. The Ausführung G version, produced from late 1942 until the end of the war, represented the most numerous and perfected model. It incorporated the StuG III L48 gun, 80mm frontal armor, and a slightly redesigned casemate to improve the projectile bounce angle as standard. This model also generalized the use of lateral Schürzen, and from 1944 so-called beds were added for mounting additional armor plates on the front, intended to resist impacts from increasingly powerful weapons like the Soviet 85mm anti-tank gun. In terms of observation and aiming, the AUSFG received important improvements. The gunner's telescopic sight was adapted to fire accurately at greater distances, and the commander could have additional periscopes in his cupola. From 1943, an electric fan was introduced on the roof of the casemate, which helped reduce the accumulation of smoke and heat, especially after consecutive rapid shots. Adaptations to terrain and climate were another key aspect. On the Soviet front, many StuG III AUSFG received wider tracks to improve mobility on snow and deep mud. In regions like Italy, where the terrain was mountainous, brakes and transmission were reinforced to handle steep slopes. In the West, especially during the defense of Normandy, some vehicles received camouflage nets and supports for vegetation, with the aim of better hiding from aerial observation and enemy gunners. The additional armor and heavier armament increased the total weight of the vehicle, which in the G version reached around 24 tons. This slightly affected the maximum road speed, which was around 40 kilometers per hour, but the sacrifice was acceptable for greater survivability on the battlefield. The crews learned to use the low profile and the new gun to ambush enemy armored vehicles from hidden positions, taking advantage of natural cover or urban ruins to fire at short or medium distances and withdraw before receiving a counterattack. In parallel with these physical improvements, changes in internal equipment were developed. The radios were modernized to allow for clearer and faster communications, which facilitated coordination with infantry units and other armored sections. Compartments for tools, spare parts and field equipment were also added, seeking for each vehicle to be able to operate autonomously for longer periods, without immediately depending on logistical support units. The transition from a short gun to a long one, along with improved armor and observation systems, transformed the StuG III from an infantry support weapon into a true tank destroyer capable of facing many of the enemy armored vehicles of the time. This versatility allowed it to play different roles depending on the front. In the east, it acted in both assault missions and defensive ambushes. In the west, it supported counterattack operations or resisted in static positions. In North Africa, it served as fire support in long-distance combat, taking advantage of the visibility of the desert. The modifications continued even in the last years of the war. In 1944, faced with the growing threat of Allied aviation, some StuG III received mountings for MG-34 or MG-42 anti-aircraft machine guns on the top, partially protected by a metal shield. Experiments were also conducted with metallic mesh armor skirts, which were lighter than solid plates and capable of detonating hollow charges before they reached the main hull. Doctrine and tactical employment. The Sturmgeschütz III, initially conceived as a direct support weapon for the infantry, was integrated into a specific organizational structure in the German army. The units in charge of operating it were named Sturmgeschütz Abteilungen, battalions of assault guns formed to operate autonomously or in support of other arms. Each Abteilung was composed, in its initial phases, of 3 batteries, and each battery had 6 vehicles. With the passage of time and the expansion of production, these figures varied, increasing the number of vehicles per battery to reinforce their firepower. The command of each unit fell to officers trained in both artillery and mechanized support tactics, since the StuG III combined characteristics of both areas. In practice, these units acted as a link between traditional artillery and armored forces. Their main mission was to provide direct fire against fortifications, machine gun positions, light artillery nests, and enemy troop concentrations. This function was complemented by the ability to engage enemy armored vehicles when the situation required it, especially after the introduction of long guns in later versions. However, the initial doctrine did not conceive them as pure tank destroyers, but as assault vehicles that closely accompanied the infantry. In the attack, the StuG III usually advanced in staggered or line formation, maintaining a sufficient distance to prevent a single enemy shot from damaging several vehicles at once. The advance was carried out at low speed, coordinating each movement with the progression of the infantry troops. Fire was carried out from advantageous positions or behind partial cover, seeking to minimize exposure. The battery commanders were responsible for selecting priority targets and ordering concentrated fire to eliminate threats before they could react. Once a strong point was neutralized, the vehicles resumed the advance, always with the infantry nearby to protect them from short-range attacks. In defensive operations, the StuG III was deployed as a key element to slow down enemy advances. In these cases, the Doctrine established the occupation of pre-selected positions with good fields of fire from where they could hit approach routes and open areas. The advantage of their low profile allowed them to camouflage more easily than a conventional tank, increasing their chances of surprising enemy armored units. Often, commanders organized ambushes in which the first shot had to be lethal, forcing the enemy to stop or maneuver under fire. Compared to German tanks with a rotating turret, such as the Panzer IV or the Panther, the StuG III presented both advantages and limitations. Its lower silhouette made it more difficult to detect and easier to hide in irregular or urban terrain. The frontal armor was competitive against many enemy models from the first half of the war. The absence of a rotating turret forced the entire hull to be oriented toward the target, which slowed down the acquisition of mobile targets and exposed the flanks in change-of-direction maneuvers. This required very precise coordination with the infantry and other armored vehicles to prevent the enemy from approaching from dangerous angles. The role of the StuG III also differed from that of specialized tank destroyers, such as the Marder or the Jagdpanzer IV. The latter were designed exclusively to destroy enemy tanks, with high-velocity guns and less emphasis on infantry support. The StuG III, on the other hand, retained its double role as an assault weapon and an improvised tank destroyer throughout its career, which gave it valuable tactical flexibility on fronts where resources were limited. One of the most used procedures in offensives was to assign each StuG a specific sector of advance and observation. The gunners were trained to change targets quickly, always prioritizing enemy anti-tank weapons and resistance points that could slow down the infantry. Communication between the vehicle commander and the infantry company leader was constant, via radio or visual signals to adjust the pace of the attack. On open ground, fire and movement maneuvers were used. While one section of StuGs kept the enemy under fire, the other advanced to shorten distances or find a more favorable angle. In defense, a recurring tactic was hit and retreat. The StuG III would emerge from its hiding position, fire one or two projectiles, and immediately retreat to safer cover before enemy artillery or tanks could return fire accurately. This method was especially effective in wooded or urban areas where the vehicles could use narrow streets, squares, or clearings in the forest as temporary firing points. Working together with the infantry was essential. The foot soldiers protected the StuG III from attacks with portable weapons, mines, and hollow charges, while the assault guns eliminated fortified positions and enemy vehicles that threatened the infantry. In ideal conditions, the advance was carried out with the StuGs slightly ahead, but without losing the cover of the troops. This symbiosis required mutual training, since poor coordination could leave the vehicles vulnerable at the most critical moment. The most obvious tactical limitations derived from its lateral mobility and the absence of a turret. In engagements against tanks with a rotating turret, the StuG III was at a disadvantage if the enemy managed to flank it. This required always having a precise knowledge of the terrain and possible approach routes. In areas with natural obstacles, such as hills or buildings, commanders often placed several StuGs in staggered positions to mutually cover their flanks. Even so, the risk of being immobilized or surrounded was present, especially in urban combat or during hurried retreats. The terrain decisively influenced the employment tactics. In open spaces, the ability to camouflage and the range of the gun were the main advantages, while in forests or cities, short-range ambushes were prioritized. On the Eastern Front, the extensive plains and limited visibility due to the weather required intensive use of prepared positions and cooperation with reconnaissance units to avoid surprises. In North Africa, the clear terrain allowed for long-distance shots, but it also left the StuGs exposed to aerial observation and artillery fire. Tactical formations varied depending on the mission. In a concentrated attack against a fortified point, the StuGs could align parallel to each other to maximize the volume of fire. In covering a retreat, they were deployed in depth so that each line could cover the retreat of the previous one. In defense of a wide sector, they were distributed in a staggered manner to cover the largest possible area, accepting the risk of operating in pairs or even individually, although this reduced the combined firepower. As the war progressed, the StuG III received improvements that facilitated its tactical work, such as more precise sights, more powerful radios, and additional armor. However, these improvements did not eliminate its structural limitations. The Doctrine was adapted to compensate for them, encouraging the use of terrain, camouflage, and combined arms coordination as key elements to maximize its effectiveness. In training, special emphasis was placed on quick aiming and changing targets without losing the rate of fire. The crew members learned to calculate distances and to recognize the silhouettes of enemy vehicles so that they could react in seconds to the appearance of a threat. They were also trained in the replacement of essential parts in combat conditions, such as damaged tracks or components of the aiming system, to return the vehicle to action as quickly as possible. In combined operations with tanks, the StuG III usually occupied secondary positions, covering the flanks or acting as reinforcement in sectors where strong resistance was expected. In these cases, its low profile and its precision were advantages, but they depended on the tanks maintaining the enemy's attention to prevent the assault guns from becoming the main target. In short, the tactical employment of the StuG III was the result of a balance between its technical capabilities and the changing demands of the battlefield. Its effectiveness depended as much on the characteristics of the vehicle as on the skill of the crews and the coordination with other arms. Although it was not without vulnerabilities, its correct tactical use allowed it to be one of the most versatile and feared armored vehicles on multiple fronts, playing a role that went far beyond its original conception as a simple assault gun. The case of the Sturmgeschütz Abteilung 202. The Sturmgeschütz Abteilung 202 was formed as part of the expansion of the German armored forces at the beginning of the war, when the command decided to increase the number of units equipped with assault guns. Its creation responded to the need for a battalion specialized in direct infantry support, with the capacity to operate independently in specific sectors. The initial core of the unit was established with personnel from artillery and other mechanized formations, selected for their experience in handling large-caliber pieces and in operations with armored vehicles. The official roster included 3 batteries, each with several StuG IIIs, in addition to command vehicles and supply transport. The first vehicles assigned to the Abteilung corresponded to initial versions of the StuG III, with a shotgun and frontal armor adapted to the needs of the first years of the conflict. Before entering combat, the unit underwent an intensive training period that included shooting practice, travel on different types of terrain, and coordination with infantry. The training sought to familiarize the crews with the vehicle's behavior in different conditions and with the execution of precise shots from static and moving positions. The battery commanders dedicated time to training in basic maintenance procedures to ensure that each crew could resolve minor breakdowns without always depending on the workshops. Once the training phase was completed, the Sturmgeschütz Abteilung 202 received its first operational assignment. Its initial deployment took place on a front where the terrain combined open and wooded areas, which required the crews to constantly adapt. In the first engagements, the StuG III showed its ability to neutralize fortified positions and to act as close fire support for the infantry. Reports from the time indicate that the unit effectively carried out the assigned orders, although the conditions of the terrain and enemy resistance generated the first casualties in both vehicles and personnel. The operational timeline of Abteilung 202 includes prolonged campaigns in sectors where climatic conditions varied extremely. In some deployments, low temperatures made it difficult to start the engines and hardened the work of the crews, who had to operate in cabins with minimal insulation. The cold weather also affected the mobility of the vehicles, as ice and snow reduced traction and complicated movement. On the contrary, in warmer seasons, dust and mud became constant problems, affecting visibility and accelerating mechanical wear. In several phases of its operations, the unit faced a numerous and well-armed enemy, which forced it to deploy its StuG IIIs in defensive formations to slow down advances. In these combats, the crews learned to take advantage of the low silhouette of the vehicles to open fire from prepared positions. However, reports record considerable losses when the enemy managed to maneuver to attack the flanks or the rear. One of the most documented episodes about the losses of Abteilung 202 refers to a confrontation in which several StuGs were hit by concentrated enemy anti-tank fire. The German positions had been detected after the first shots, and the counterattack forced a retreat. In the process, some vehicles were immobilized by damage to the tracks or the transmission system, which forced the crews to evacuate under fire. This type of incident showed the vulnerability of the vehicle when it was exposed and without maneuverability. In other cases, the losses of vehicles and personnel were due to a combination of tactical and environmental factors. During an operation in a sector with swampy terrain, several StuGs got stuck in deep mud, becoming easy targets for enemy artillery. Despite the efforts to tow them with other armored vehicles, the terrain conditions made rescue impossible in the middle of combat, and the StuGs had to be abandoned. The documentation indicates that the crews, upon evacuating, removed key parts to prevent them from falling intact into enemy hands. The unit also participated in offensive actions in which the speed of advance was a decisive factor. In operations of this type, the StuGs of Abteilung 202 advanced alongside the infantry, opening a path with concentrated fire on defensive positions. Several reports describe how the precision of the shots allowed them to silence machine gun nests and anti-tank pieces, facilitating the advance of the troops. However, the speed of the offensive increased the risk of being isolated from supply lines, which sometimes reduced the availability of ammunition and fuel at critical moments. The weather continued to be a determining element throughout its history. In winter campaigns, the freezing of moving parts, such as locks and turning mechanisms, slowed down the ability to respond in combat. Preventive maintenance in extreme cold conditions involved starting the engines at regular intervals during the night and protecting the most sensitive parts with improvised covers. In the summer, high temperatures caused overheating in the engines and increased the fatigue of the crews, who had to operate in armored compartments without sufficient ventilation. The interaction with the terrain and the characteristics of the enemy influenced all the operational results of Abteilung 202. In urban areas, combat became more unpredictable due to the abundance of ambush points. In these environments, crews had to advance with extreme caution, using covering fire from other StuGs and from the infantry. Even so, the risk of short-distance attacks with portable weapons was constant. In rural and open areas, on the other hand, the main danger came from long-distance clashes with enemy armored units or with well-positioned anti-tank artillery. The historical documentation shows that despite the difficulties, the Sturmgeschütz Abteilung 202 maintained a high level of operability for a large part of its existence. The combination of accumulated experience, specific training, and adaptations to local conditions allowed its StuG IIIs to be effective in different scenarios. However, the losses of personnel and material were inevitable in an environment of constant war, and each campaign left a mark on the unit's capacity. Toward the final phases of its participation in the conflict, Abteilung 202 operated with more modern and better armed vehicles, which increased its ability to face enemy armored vehicles. Even so, the pressure of rival offensives and the reduction of resources limited its potential. Operations focused more and more on defensive actions, where previous experience and knowledge of the terrain were decisive for resisting the enemy's advance. Vulnerability and extreme mortality. The Sturmgeschütz III was conceived as a direct support weapon for the infantry, designed to destroy fortified positions and neutralize targets at short and medium distances. However, its technical configuration and its evolution throughout the conflict made it increasingly susceptible to lethal damage. Despite the improvements introduced during the war, a series of structural and combat factors conditioned its survival capacity and explain why the mortality of the crews reached such high figures, estimated at around 80%. One of the most determining elements in this vulnerability was the armor. In its first versions, the StuG III had sufficient frontal protection to withstand fire from light weapons and small-caliber artillery. However, the side and rear armor was much thinner, which made it vulnerable to attacks from the flanks or the rear. In practice, this difference in protection meant that a projectile that hit those areas had a high probability of penetrating and causing serious damage. Even with the increase in armor thickness in later versions, the increase in enemy firepower largely negated these improvements. The interior space of the vehicle represented another critical factor. The compact design of the StuG III, intended to maintain a low profile and facilitate camouflage, considerably reduced the margin of movement within the combat compartment. The proximity between the crew members and the location of the ammunition implied that in case of armor penetration, the effects were immediate and devastating. An impact could incapacitate several crew members at once, and the limited ability to maneuver inside made any attempt at a quick evacuation difficult. The arrangement of the ammunition inside the vehicle amplified these risks. A large part of the projectiles were stored in the same compartment where the gun servants operated, with additional reserves in lateral areas and on the floor. This distribution, while optimizing access to ammunition during combat, exposed all the material to the possibility of detonating if an enemy projectile hit the storage area. The resulting internal explosions often completely destroyed the vehicle and killed the crew instantly. The types of impact that most contributed to the mortality of the crews were varied. Anti-tank artillery in medium and heavy calibers represented one of the main dangers. Projectiles from 76mm, 85mm, and even larger guns could penetrate the frontal armor of the first versions of the StuG III, and in later models, although the protection increased, there were still vulnerabilities in specific points such as joints and less reinforced areas. Field artillery was also capable of neutralizing these vehicles when it hit them with direct shots, especially in short-distance confrontations. Portable infantry weapons, such as anti-tank rifles in the early years of the war, lost effectiveness with the increase in armor, but were replaced by rocket launchers and portable anti-tank grenades, which could be used at very short distances in urban or wooded environments. These attacks, although less frequent than artillery impacts, usually occurred in ambush situations, which reduced the crew's chances of responding. Aviation added an additional risk factor. Air attacks with rockets, light bombs, and automatic cannons could destroy a StuG III or leave it useless in seconds. The vehicle's roof, which was relatively thin compared to the frontal armor, offered little resistance to the penetration of projectiles launched from the air. In addition, the inability to maneuver quickly or hide in open terrain increased exposure to this type of threat. On fronts like the eastern one, where the density of anti-tank weapons was high, the chances of a StuG III being hit grew significantly. The long lines of fire allowed the enemy to locate and attack the vehicles from safe distances, taking advantage of the superior range of some pieces. In scenarios like these, the strategy of remaining in defensive positions partially reduced the risk, but also limited the mobility necessary to evade coordinated attacks. The most cited statistic to illustrate this situation is the crew mortality rate, which is estimated at 80% throughout the war. This data reflects both the lethality of the impacts and the difficulties of evacuating a damaged vehicle. Unlike some tanks that offered greater escape routes or more spacious compartments, the StuG III forced its crew members to exit through small hatches, which in situations of intense fire was almost impossible. Documented cases of StuG III destruction on different fronts show recurring patterns. In North Africa, the open terrain and visibility favored British anti-tank guns, which could fire from camouflaged positions at long distances. In these confrontations, losses were usually concentrated on vehicles that advanced without adequate cover. Impacts in the lateral areas were especially dangerous, since the thinner armor could not resist high-caliber projectiles. In Western Europe, battles in urban environments exposed the StuG III to attacks from the upper floors of buildings or from basements, taking advantage of blind spots that the main armament could not cover. Anti-tank grenades launched from a short distance could cause immediate fires, and the accumulation of smoke in the interior compartment reduced the chances of survival. In these circumstances, coordination with supporting infantry was essential to prevent attackers from getting close. On the Eastern Front, the Red Army's 76mm guns became a constant threat. Even in conditions of numerical inferiority, Soviet units would often concentrate the fire of several pieces on the same target until it was disabled. Repeated impacts in the same sector of the armor increased the chances of penetration, and once a breach was opened, internal destruction was almost immediate. The appearance of 85mm guns and even more powerful pieces in the final phase of the conflict worsened the situation. The vulnerability of the StuG III was not only due to external factors, but also to limitations inherent in its design. The absence of a rotating turret, for example, reduced the ability to respond quickly to threats from different angles. To point the gun at a lateral target, it was necessary to turn the entire vehicle, which in close combat or on rough terrain consumed time that could be decisive. In many cases, this delay offered the enemy a window of opportunity to shoot first. The measures adopted to reduce these vulnerabilities included reinforcing the frontal armor with additional plates and the introduction of side skirts to protect the tracks and the lower sides of the hull. The firepower was also increased with longer guns, capable of engaging enemy armored vehicles at greater distances. However, each technical improvement caused an increase in the total weight of the vehicle, which in turn affected mobility and mechanical reliability. On some fronts, the crew tried to compensate for these weaknesses by using more conservative defensive tactics and close coordination with other arms. However, in offensive operations where the advance had to be fast and sustained, the chances of exposure to enemy fire increased considerably, and losses were inevitable. Testimonies from the time describe scenes in which a single impact was enough to turn the interior of the StuG III into a lethal space. The combined effect of shrapnel, the ignition of the ammunition, and the accumulation of smoke made survival depend almost exclusively on how quickly the crew could reach the hatches. In ideal conditions, this maneuver could be completed in seconds, but under enemy fire and with the vehicle in motion, the probabilities were drastically reduced. In wooded areas or with abundant vegetation, the danger came from the proximity of the enemy. Short-range ambushes allowed opposing forces to attack the least protected areas of the vehicle. Even smaller caliber projectiles could be effective if they hit vulnerable points such as the engine's air inlets or the armor joints. The StuG III's ability to react in these cases depended on the early detection of the threat and the cover provided by Allied units. In the last months of the war, operational conditions worsened for all German armored vehicles, including the StuG III. The scarcity of spare parts and fuel limited the possibilities of keeping the vehicles in optimal condition. The crews had to operate in scenarios where the enemy had numerical and material superiority, which further increased the probability of suffering lethal impacts. In this context, the losses of personnel and material reached maximum levels. Photographic and written records show examples of StuG III destroyed in different environments, some with visible damage to the front from direct artillery impacts, others with tracks torn off by mines, and several more completely burned after internal fires. In all cases, the final position of the vehicle and the type of damage allow us to deduce the sequence of events and the type of weaponry used against them. The analysis of the vulnerability and mortality of the StuG III reveals a combination of technical and tactical factors. The limited lateral and upper protection, the reduced internal space, the location of the ammunition, and the increasing capabilities of enemy weapons converge to make this vehicle an effective but dangerous weapon for those who operated it. The mortality figures not only reflect the lethality of armored combat, but also the limitations that no technical improvement could completely resolve. Final battles and the end of the StuG III. In the first months of 1945, the Sturmgeschütz III faced the most critical moment in its operational history. German forces were in constant retreat on all fronts, and the vehicle, which in previous years had been a tactical resource of high value, came to perform increasingly limited functions. The offensive role was practically ruled out, and its use was concentrated on the defense of positions, particularly in urban environments and at strategic points where it was necessary to resist the enemy's advance for as long as possible. The drastic reduction in the supply of fuel, the scarcity of ammunition, and the decrease in specialized personnel decisively conditioned the way these assault guns were used in the final phase of the war. On the Eastern Front, the pressure from the Red Army was overwhelming. Soviet offensives had broken several defensive lines and were pushing German forces west at great speed. In these circumstances, the StuG III was used as a means to slow the progression of enemy armored vehicles and mechanized units within urban areas or at obligatory crossings. The advantage of its low profile and its high-power gun remained useful on narrow streets and in prepared ambushes, but the ability to maneuver and reposition was seriously compromised by the lack of fuel. Many vehicles remained in the same emplacement for days, waiting for a target, to avoid spending resources on unnecessary displacements. On the Western Front, the circumstances were different but equally adverse. Allied air superiority made any daytime movement difficult, forcing the StuG III to move only at night or under weather conditions that reduced visibility. This affected coordination with the infantry and limited the possibilities of counterattack. In several German cities and along strategic routes, these vehicles were installed in static positions, using them more as fixed artillery pieces than as mobile assault guns. Commanders tried to take advantage of the remains of fortifications, rubble and demolished buildings to reinforce the natural armor offered by the terrain, minimizing exposure to direct attacks. The training of crews had been reduced to a minimum due to the lack of time and resources. The constant casualties among experienced personnel forced the incorporation of drivers and gunners with accelerated instruction, who often lacked the necessary experience to exploit all the vehicle's capabilities. This resulted in tactical errors, poor coordination on the battlefield, and an increase in losses. Mechanics and technicians were also scarce, which made it difficult to repair damage or perform preventive maintenance, increasing the number of inoperative StuG IIIs due to mechanical breakdowns. The lack of ammunition was another serious problem. The reserves of armor-piercing and high-explosive projectiles were insufficient, and in many cases crews had to ration each shot, saving it for priority targets. The manufacture of ammunition was affected by Allied bombing of industrial facilities and by the loss of territories that supplied raw materials. On some fronts, the StuG IIIs were deployed with an initial complement well below the regulation, which limited in advance the duration of their effective participation in any combat. In the defences of cities like Berlin, Königsberg or Breslau, the StuG III played a visible role. They were used on main streets, squares and strategic intersections, where they could cover approach avenues and temporarily block the advance of enemy armoured vehicles. The usual tactic consisted of placing them behind rubble barricades or at angles that offered a controlled field of fire. From these positions they could hit enemy vehicles before being detected, although the opposing response was quick and forceful. On more than one occasion, StuG IIIs were destroyed in the same place where they had been emplaced, becoming additional obstacles within the urban battlefield. In some cases, damaged or fuel-less vehicles were partially buried in the ground, leaving only the gun and part of the front visible to act as improvised anti-tank guns. This technique, already used in earlier phases of the war, became a recurring solution to take advantage of chassis that would otherwise have been abandoned. However, once fixed in the ground, these StuG IIIs were exposed to enemy artillery and could not retreat, which meant that their destruction was a matter of time. In rural sectors, the role of the StuG III was limited to supporting resistance points in towns or crossroads. The reduced mobility prevented large-scale harassment operations, and most of the confrontations took place at short distances. The advantage of camouflage was greater in these areas, but the enemy firepower and the growing presence of portable anti-armor weapons kept the risk high for the crews. Toward the end of the conflict, many units received orders to hold positions until the last moment, even when retreat was the most logical option from a military point of view. This was due to strategic decisions aimed at delaying the enemy's advance and allowing the evacuation of civilians or other units. The result was that numerous StuG IIIs were isolated, with no possibility of receiving reinforcements or supplies, and ended up being destroyed or captured. The capture of these vehicles by the Allies and the Red Army was frequent in the last months. On occasion, they were taken intact due to the surrender of their crews, who understood the futility of resisting without resources. These StuG IIIs were then studied by the enemies, or in some cases, temporarily reused by them. Photographs from the time show columns of captured vehicles being transported to the rear, some still with their original emblems visible. In Berlin, during April and May of 1945, the use of the StuG III reached its last stage. Distributed in strategic neighborhoods, they faced Soviet tanks and guns in combats of very high intensity. The narrow streets and the number of obstacles allowed them to take advantage of short-distance ambushes, but the overwhelming numerical superiority of the enemy made any success ephemeral. Reports indicate that many StuG IIIs were destroyed a few hours after entering action, and the survivors had to constantly change position to avoid being located. In Königsberg, a similar situation was experienced during the Soviet siege. The available StuG IIIs were positioned in key sectors of the city, firing from shadowed streets or protected by walls and demolished buildings. When the defences gave way, several of these vehicles were abandoned due to lack of fuel, or because the destruction of the escape routes prevented any retreat. The defence of Breslau, which lasted until May, also featured StuG III in static artillery roles. Placed in improvised fortifications, they operated as long-range pieces against approaching enemy columns. The lack of ammunition forced them to prioritize targets and avoid unnecessary shots, which reduced the rate of fire and, consequently, the pressure they could exert on the attacker. In the rural areas of Pomerania and Silesia, some StuG IIIs were integrated into mixed formations with tanks and light armored vehicles. These groups tried to close gaps in the front or slow down deep enemy penetrations. However, the lack of mechanical mobility and the exhaustion of logistical resources condemned these actions to be temporary. When the resistance broke, the StuG IIIs were at the mercy of enemy forces, who in many cases chose to destroy them on the spot. On the Western Front, StuG III operations during the last months focused on covering retreat routes and maintaining temporary checkpoints. Allied air superiority limited any prolonged movement, and long-range artillery fire could destroy positions without the StuG IIIs having an opportunity to respond. In cities like Cologne and Hamburg, they were used to block main accesses and as a deterrent against rapid incursions by enemy armored vehicles, although the effect was limited. The lack of fuel was an insurmountable obstacle. Many vehicles were immobilized in the same position for weeks, unable to actively contribute to combat. Some were destroyed by their own crews to prevent their capture, while others were abandoned because there were no means to recover them. The image of StuG IIIs immobile in the middle of streets or fields, surrounded by combat debris, became a symbol of the logistical collapse of the German army in 1945. The last operational phase of the StuG III was marked by the use of incomplete units and mixed crews. Surviving vehicles from different formations were grouped to try to form a minimum force capable of holding a sector. The lack of coordination and joint experience made these groups fragile against a well-planned attack. As soon as a vehicle was destroyed, the defensive capacity of the group was drastically reduced. With the total collapse of the front in May of 1945, the remaining operational StuG IIIs were destroyed by their crews, abandoned or captured. Some, damaged but recoverable, were repaired by the victorious armies to be used in tests or, in specific cases, as part of their own units for a brief time. The majority, however, ended up scrapped or stored in depots, thus closing the operational history of one of the most used vehicles by Germany during the Second World War. The end of the StuG III in combat was not the result of a single factor, but of an accumulation of circumstances: loss of offensive capacity, mechanical wear, lack of supplies, and constant enemy pressure. In its last days, it stopped being the mobile assault gun it had been conceived to be, and became a static defensive resource, a symbol of a crumbling war effort. Although its legacy as an effective weapon remained, the outcome of its use was marked by the inevitability of defeat.